5:31, so I want to go ahead and get started. Uh, there it is. As a reminder, this is the Trauma Informed Care Task Force for the city of Baltimore. Really excited to be with you all here tonight. As a further reminder, this meeting is being streamed live on YouTube. And additionally, we are recording. Wanted to just start by acknowledging that I think this has been a tough month and sort of a tough stretch for our city, just with a lot of death, some related to homicide, some related to firefighters being trapped in a building, some related to overdoses, COVID. And from what I've observed, I think a lot of folks are struggling from a mental health perspective. I've seen a lot more conflicts escalate quickly and in some cases turn violent and deadly. And I've just seen a lot more people suffering. All that to be said, I think to me, that's why this task force is so critically important for our city. It's the opportunity to redefine how we engage with each other, how we support each other, how we love each other. And I think we need a lot of support right now as a city. So I am grateful to get to do this work with you all. It truly is one of the best parts of my week. And I'm excited for tonight's conversation. I did want to do two really positive shout outs. Want to first shout out Fariha, who did some absolutely extraordinary advocacy on behalf of her school and some other schools. And as a result, there were 3 schools that were slated to be closed, I believe this year, at the end of this year, and they have been delayed by another year. And so wanted to start with a big shout out to Fariha for really standing up for both her school and just students and staff across our city. Good on you. Also want to give some props to Elijah, from our task force as well, who just got a gig with Rec and Park doing photography. I've said this before, I'll say this again. This man is supremely talented with the camera. If you have photographing needs, definitely hire him. I have done so and it has been wonderful, but excited to see Elijah working with our friends over at Rec and Park. So congrats to you. Fariha, what you missed was I was just giving you props for having delayed the school closings and just your exceptional advocacy on that front. Very grateful for what you did. So with that, it is now 5:35. So I want to go straight into our breakout room, round the horn. Let's get going on that. So the prompt is, how do you make it through winter? What is one thing you do to support yourself in the cold months? And Anne, if you could just put us into our little groups.
All right, we're going to regroup at 5:38.
It's a quick one.
It is.
Hello all. Sorry, I was in and then out, and now I'm back. Sorry. Hey.
All right, so welcome back, everybody. Really excited for a great DEI presentation tonight by our friend and phenomenal teacher, Dan Parsons. Fariha, do you want to introduce? Or do you want me to go straight to Dan?
You can go straight to Dan. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, Dan, you are up. The topic is capitalism and the trauma of poverty. Dan Parsons, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Zeke. Thanks, Priya. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Hold on one second, move some stuff to get my dog out of the room. So we're going to begin our presentation on capitalism and the trauma of poverty. One of the things that I want to do first is just acknowledge how huge of a topic this is, and I hope that this is only one of a multiple of presentations that are made on this topic. I think this is a topic that can be approached from so many different angles. Also, I want to talk a little bit about how, in many ways, I may not be the best person to present on this topic. I want to sort of acknowledge that up front. I have never experienced poverty myself. I have never had to survive poverty myself. But it is a thing that has sort of haunted my family, and it's been part of the mythos of my family since I was very, very young. My great-grandfather shot himself in the 50s. He was a survivor of the Great Depression, and according to family lore, he had endured too much financial hardship as a sharecropper in Iowa, moved from farm to farm, eventually made it to California. Was a janitor in a public school there, and the way the story is passed down in my family, he couldn't take the fact that his life had never been successful, right? That he'd never been economically successful. And so my grandfather made it his life goal to climb the ladder into the middle class. And of course, the way he told the story, he did it through just excessive hard work and self-determination. And that was the myth that I inherited. It would be, of course, later on that I would learn and understand that he ascended a ladder that was built exclusively for him as a white man in the 1940s and 50s. But his son, according to family lore, when his money ran out, also shot himself. So I have a family that is obsessed not just with class and status as part of the myth that we tell ourselves. It's also a family that has covered up a lot of the struggle and trauma that they have dealt with when it comes to facing poverty and issues that surround poverty. So that's one. I myself was raised by a father who was in the military, so I was aggressively middle class. But one, I think, very important thing to mention before, obviously, I became a teacher and became a witness for the last 10 years to the extremities of poverty that we see in our city here that I think we're all very familiar with. I had, in third grade, my father was stationed overseas. He was in the first Gulf War, multiple wars after that. So he wasn't around very much. My mother experienced a pretty traumatic event in her life. Her brother died, and at his funeral, she had a miscarriage. And from that moment on, basically, up until my high school days, she was in a pretty extended, protracted state of depression that involved her joining a cult and pulling me out of school. And I was homeschooled during this time. And in the cult that she was a part of, it just so happened that the predominant members were first generation Mexican Americans. And so I became homeschooled, and I would go every single day to my friend's house, and they lived in a trailer park off Rayford Road in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And this is where I spent most of my childhood. And it was very, very interesting, given sort of what I've already said about my early life, because it was a place I traveled to, and my friends were there. But I also carried with me the idea, the myth that I told you that my grandfather had instilled in me, that I could leave it. It wasn't a place I had to survive. Even though I could see it, I didn't have to survive it. And so I want to foreground what I'm about to talk about today with that story, because a lot of work has been done, especially in my family, to cover up their own experiences of trauma as it relates to poverty. And I think this is going to relate specifically to how I want to frame it today in the discussion. Again, this is a huge topic that can be approached from so many angles. But I want to jump into the topic by first sort of stating that I don't think any group of people in our country is more persistently studied, surveilled, measured, observed, looked at than people who have to survive poverty. And if we compare the amount of energy and time that we put into studying what we could quote unquote call the problem, that vastly outstrips the amount of actual money and effort we spend to solve the problem. It's almost as if there's an industry designed to surveil constantly and consistently the poor. And this is crucial to sort of understanding how this works, because if you have a society that is set up on the notion that success means being better than other people, then you must guard the borders. Okay, so I want to talk specifically about the session goals here, because I don't want to fall into the trap of retrenching the problem. I think many of us in here are experts at various levels of the problem. We've seen several amazing presentations that have outlined different aspects. We've read books, we've lived lives that have encountered the issue. So I want to think about it in these terms. Here's my goal for the session. The focus of this discussion is to think about the building of a machine. And this machine is designed for one purpose: the production and maintenance of poverty. And there's a reason why this happens. The product of this machine is profitable. And I want to pause here because I think it's helpful to tell a little story in regards to this. I want you to imagine a town. This is a fictional town where there's a huge gap between the working poor and the wealthy. And the wealthy have beautiful houses up on the hill, and their children get to play in beautiful playgrounds, and they have private tutors who come and teach them some of the best ideas that have ever been thought. And the working poor have to work in the mills and do all the dirty work. They have to be the hewers of wood and drawers of water. And of course, they don't like this condition and they complain about it constantly. Well, one day, it just so happens that while the wealthy in their beautiful houses are racking their brains about what to do about this problem, as they phrase it, a snake oil salesman comes to town, and he's driving this strange contraption that no one has ever seen before. And they ask him, what is this machine? And he says, this machine can end all of the difficulties that you're facing in your town. It can heal the divisions between the rich and the poor. It's a very simple machine. You see, this machine can tell exactly how much each person in this town is worth, what their merit is to society. All your children have to do is perform a little test. And if they pass the test, well, then they deserve goods. And if they don't, well, then they're going to have to work. And so everyone accepts this as a solution. They say, this is fine. This is a great thing to do. At the end of it, the best of us will rise. And so they set a date at which all the children will take this test. And the rich, they go up to their houses and they strategize. And the poor, they go to their houses and they stress. Because this machine has the ability to transform their lives. The rich understand that nothing is ever going to change. And they tell their children that this machine is just a game. the poor tell their children that everything in their life depends on what they do with this machine. So the day of the test comes along, they take it. And of course, the outcomes were predicted before we can even, the children of the rich score well, and the children of the poor, because they were terrified the day they took the test, everything in their life was riding on it, they fail. And the rich come out and they're given a new gift, because nothing changes except their ability to say to the poor, see, you deserve this. And while that story may have the structure of a parable, it identically mirrors the meritocracy that we've built in our society, which constructs only the illusion of equal access, because it's predicated on an unequal beginning. All right, so this machine was intentionally built for this purpose. Okay, so if we think of it the way Max Weber sort of talks about capitalism, it is really a moral force. It's a moral force that promises to build a literal heaven on earth. But here's the problem with heaven. In order to have a heaven, you have to invent a hell. And so capitalism invents and maintains that hell very, very well. Okay, so before we do that, I want to show you, I want to show a very small video clip here, I think, of, see if I can do this without ending the show completely. I'm going to switch over. I'm going to show just a couple minutes from a speech that Dr. King gave at Stanford towards the end of his life. One of the last speeches he gave, this is in 1967. I believe this was September, so this is April. So this is a year before he's murdered. I'm just going to hit play on this.
Because there are literally two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation. In many senses, America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, freedom and human dignity for their spirits.
So I'm not sure if you can see the screen. I think I'm having trouble sharing the video part. Let me try this again. There we go. Hopefully that's.
Walgreens, do you know February?
All right. I'm going to skip. I'll go right back into the presentation since having some problems with YouTube. The most important thing that King, this is the speech that is his To America speech, a very famous speech he gives. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. And later on, he's going to develop the idea that in this America, there are conditions that create little clouds that appear in the consciousness of children. And of course, this argument is going to become very, very important. It's a powerful metaphor, and I suggest that you watch that entire speech on your own. You probably are familiar with it already. I think it's captured spectacularly by this photograph here by Gordon Parks. And it's picked up by Kenneth and Mamie Clark in their work that eventually overturns school segregation, Brown v. Board of Education. But I want to kind of zoom in on this idea of the little mental clouds that can appear in the minds of children, because I really want to get us to think a little bit about the spirituality of capitalism for a second, because while capitalism produces trauma in sort of very specific and difficult situations that people must survive, that trauma may not necessarily be the end of the line. I think there is something that trauma then produces itself, and that is shame. And shame may be the most powerful thing that poverty is capable of producing. If we think of poverty as a device, as a machine that produces shame, is designed to produce shame, I think that's helpful for sort of what the way I want you to think about this as literally something that is produced. That is its production. So obviously in America, poverty has a specific definition. And I'm going to talk sort of abstractly about it, but I want to come back to the specifics of what poverty is. Federal poverty guidelines are presented as a sliding scale, and these hardly keep pace with inflation. They hardly keep pace with wages, etc. When you think a little bit about how it's defined, a family of 5 cannot survive on $31,000 a year, but that is the poverty threshold. So if someone is under that that threshold, then they're designated as in poverty. Okay, so there's this is the sort of specific way that the federal government sort of defines and outlines what poverty is. But poverty itself is a much bigger thing, and it can be often subjective. We see the way in which individuals treat it as a way of signaling hierarchies from grade school on up. So when we think a little bit about how poverty operates, I want to put it in the context of sort of 2 theoretical frameworks. Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations has this sort of famous quote where he says, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but it's from the regard of their own self-interest." We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. And we never talk to them about necessities, but of their advantages. So this is sort of supposed to be the moral operating principle of capitalism, that we never can talk about need. We must always talk about how what we are asking for advantages another person. So this is from the get-go is about acknowledging a hierarchy. And if you can think a little bit about so many of the ways that we begin to frame terms in capitalism, we couch them in a sort of moral context. And this emerges out of the Middle Ages, when one had to swear allegiance you had to swear a bond to a nobleman, a bondsman. So you were bound, you were morally bound in service to someone. But in this exchange, you had to deny the fact that you were a human with needs. And the capitalist was never allowed to acknowledge that they were a human who could see you as someone with needs. Everyone is forced into a sort of moral position where they have to act self-interestedly all the time. So if we look on the other side of this, Karl Marx, literally on the opposite spectrum here, says this is an 1844 essay on the power of money, that if we assume a person to be a person and their relationship to the world to be a human one, then you can exchange love only for love, trust for trust. If you want to enjoy art, then you must be an artistically cultivated person. If you want to exercise influence over other people, you must be a person with a stimulating and encouraging effect on other people. Every one of your relations to man and nature must be a specific expression corresponding to the object of your will, of your real individual life. If you love without evoking love in return, that is, if you're loving as loving does not produce reciprocal love, if through a living expression of yourself as a loving person, you do not make yourself a beloved one, then your love is impotent, a misfortune. Okay, so he's describing a world that is the exact antithesis of the one that Adam Smith is saying exists under capitalism. One where love must be shuttered in the name of self-interest. In the world of Marx, we have a kind of recognition of what would be possible without money, right? But this is a world of care, a world that only operates on economies of care. And so these become sort of polar opposites. And when you think about sort of the problem, what we have is that our instinctual needs become sources of shame at the point that they're presented as such. And this is very clear in just sort of the daily operations of capitalism. If a person is begging on the street, someone who recognizes their need avoids eye contact with them, because to look at them is to acknowledge their shame. Is to say that you must move in the way that shame makes you feel to rectify it, which is again another moral term. And so the shame causes us not to look at reality, that reality that sort of Marx is describing. Now, in his essay on money, Marx talks about how money literally fills the gap between the world of authenticity. That Smith says, literally, we can't acknowledge that we're animals with needs, that we have to eat, that we have to have a safe place to sleep. And under capitalism, if you don't have those things, you are in some sense a failed non-entity. So literally, without money, our animal needs that don't go away, they're there, they're persistent, they are transmuted into shame. And so I think this is all obviously intensively, and again, there's going to be so much that I'm not going to be able to touch on, but this is intensified by the way in which poverty is racialized in America. And just very briefly, I kind of want to talk about how this shame sort of appears. In particular, I think where it's most important to recognize it is in the minds of children before they're too young to even notice. Obviously, the work of Kenneth and Mamie Clark, you see pictured down in the bottom, is some really important work to systematize this and call attention to this. With their doll experiments, they were able to prove that children, even at younger ages, such as 2, were perceptive to social forces of inequality that they didn't think of systematically, which a 2, 3, 4-year-old can't do. Instead, they think of it as a window to themselves. And I see this quite frequently. I often teach lessons in class about this concept, and usually I'll begin my lesson by asking students just to define the word ghetto. What does it mean? And almost 100% of students all the time, and we're talking students in high school who've already had previous classes where they've discussed these issues, still reflect that term not as a geographical location, but as a behavior, as a set of characteristics, usually synonymous with something like ignorance. This is the way they think about the word, not because it's explicitly taught to them, but because that is what they're absorbing. So this is a kind of a distorted mirror of society. And Kenneth Clark is very clear in his book that this is in no way a reflection of character or individuals, but rather a location. It is a social, political, educational, and economic colony within a superstructure. The inhabitants are subject peoples, victims of greed, cruelty, insensitivity, guilt, and fear. And one of the crazy things about all this, if you think about it, Robert Foreman talks about this in his book, Black Ghettos, White Ghettos, and Slums, that shifting between the definition of a place that's constructed and built according to principles to maintain this, and the behavior set, what one sees in between the two. And this becomes later on, Kenneth Clark's book is going to get picked up by white pseudo scholars in the 80s and 90s, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who are going to pick up some of his language and they're going to use it for some pretty perverse policy that's actually going to be very, very damaging to the very things Kenneth Clark is trying to eliminate. But what you see happening is that movement from place, constructed place, to character or behavior set is literally part of I think, one of the great crimes against humanity that comes from the direct racialization of poverty. And that is the skill sets that must be adopted in order to survive a dangerous place that has been geographically restricted and cut off from resources, become the means by which the larger society tells people that they don't deserve access to those resources. And that's a pretty powerful thing. Okay, so I want to just jump really quickly. I don't have a ton of time to go into the neurobiology, but I think what the neurobiology tells us, and there are tons of studies on this, is that poverty is really a war conducted against the prefrontal cortex. And what poverty people, children who in particular who survive poverty, see significant reductions in the growth and development of the prefrontal cortex early. Its goal, and again, I'm talking about it as if it were a conscious thing, because this is sort of, I think it's helpful to conceive of it that way, is literally to throw people directly into their amygdalas. And if you go back to the example I kind of told in the very, very beginning about some of the failures of the meritocracy, one of the problems of having to live consistently in your amygdala, because you have to survive, right? This is the center of the brain that's thinking specifically about threats. When you're confronted consistently with need, it becomes very, very difficult to plan for the future, to think about the future. You can't really do this at all. This exposes one to the violence that is compound interest. Because if someone must think only about the present in order to survive, someone's waiting for them in their future when they get here. So it's not an accident that, of course, payday loans proliferate in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. All right. So we also see this impact on education. This does have a name. It's called tunneling, and I don't have a ton of time to go deeply into it, but I encourage you to look at the work of Elder Shafir. He did some pretty interesting studies. This was really sort of mind shifting for me, and explained some of the challenges that I think right now, especially as we're seeing horrible and ridiculous, irresponsible reporting on the leaks of iReady reading data at places like Patterson, et cetera, to kind of discuss the way in which poverty is the agent that produces low scores. And so the way he thinks about it is in terms of mental bandwidth. They did some interesting studies, for example, where they went to a mall and they got volunteers in the mall. They got people who were affluent, people that were middle income, people that were poor, and they had them take a series of tests. And by and large, everyone's scored relatively the same on the test. Then they had them read a scenario where they had car trouble and they would have to spend $150 to fix their car. Then they had them take another series of tests. Then they had them read another scenario where there was more financially disastrous, where they had to spend $1,000 to fix their car. And what they found is that the rich were able to perform just as well as the poor on those tests initially. And then after the $150 challenge, that the rich were able to still perform pretty well, but that the poor, when they just simply read a scenario about having to spend $1,000 to fix their car, saw precipitous drops in their test scores. So, and this is documented over and over again with so much of the research that we're doing, that the most predictive thing when it comes to test scores of children is the income level of their parents. It becomes very, very difficult to think about high-level English standards, even if you understand them, when you're stressing about financial issues, or you're sensing stress, or you're trying to survive, or you're hungry from your previous meals. It should be obvious, and yet we persist. I'm going to come back a little bit to this question because I want to touch just briefly on predatory capitalism and how it works. We live at a time in under late capitalism where we are managed essentially by precariousness. Even the middle class no longer really exists. Sometime in the 1970s, credit cards balloon, and this is literally a direct result of some of the social movements in the 70s that were pushing, where the middle class, and in particular the children of the middle class, were pushing. They're beginning to join forces in the with folks working the Black radical tradition to call for justice and equity. We had Students for Democratic Society, for example, over at Hopkins. One of the strategies that was used to neutralize Students for Democratic Society was that the FBI sent letters to their parents with the hopes that their parents would cut them off financially. So this notion that you could use financial warfare against even the middle class by making the middle class precarious, you could challenge their commitments to pushing for an equitable and just society. This takes on a new form with the introduction of credit cards and the ballooning of credit card debt in the 1970s and 80s, which literally pushes, along with student loans, the folks who would otherwise be allies in the struggle for justice into a position where they are not able to challenge the status quo because they are now precarious, right? Their position has become precarious. So this expansion of precarity to the middle classes, in addition to the poor, is one that essentially neoliberalism uses to ensure that the status quo is maintained, while at the same time introducing new forms of capitalism, predatory capitalism, to further immiserate the poor. So you can think, for example, about the expansion of electric ankle monitoring, that folks are charged significant amounts of money per day. You know, I think it's upwards of $10 when we talk about children who don't have jobs and that are forced to go to school, required to go to school, but they can't earn an income, but still have to pay for this monitoring. In addition, you know, there's just the increasing privatization of poverty and the forms of individual solutions. And this is the interesting thing to think about. This goes back to sort of what I said at the very beginning. While the money that is made in studies of poverty, right, the surveillance of poverty is a massive industry, very little of the monies that should be spent on solving the problem actually make it to the people who need it. Because when it comes time to solve the problems of poverty, it usually goes to the wealthy. Like the grants go to someone who runs an organization that is then hiring other people that are in the middle class to come up with a strategy for dealing with poverty. So the money that would otherwise address poverty is cherry picked along the way. And so I want to just talk about one last thing here, because I know I'm definitely running out of time. If anybody's watching the show Abbott Elementary, which I'm not sure, I highly recommend the show. I'm not sure how they got a television show this accurate. I'm pretty sure that they have spies in schools, or it's just being written by teachers at schools. It's brilliant. But there was an episode recently that actually literally touched on a very specific aspect of poverty capitalism that I think we should find incredibly troubling. So one of the most devastating things that I've witnessed this year, maybe in my whole teaching career, was at the very beginning of the school year, students across the district and across the state of Maryland, this is a state requirement, were forced to take their MCAPs, their state standardized assessments, that they had missed the previous year. So I want you to imagine coming back from a pandemic and learning on a computer for an entire year, essentially with all the learning losses that we love to stress about from that time period. Imagine coming back to the classroom. And it was a beautiful month of school. I've never seen kids so eager and excited to be back into a school building, to talk to each other, to be with friends, to learn, to ask questions. They were so engaged. And then suddenly, 1 month in, you're told you must sit for your mandatory state tests that you should have taken the year before, after less than a month of instruction. It was a pretty brutal move. And I personally, as an educator, can't understand why that move was made. But when you look into the numbers, you realize that about $5 million was cut from the MSDE budget from the year before because the test wasn't taken. And so if we went another year without taking the test, again, we would have another significant cut from the budget. So these become financial decisions that are deeply, deeply harmful for children. And this was the story across the district here, that after those tests, that sort of miraculous period quickly disintegrated. Culture across buildings went south very, very fast. For example, over at Carver, the 9th grade had to lock down because and this literally happens the week that we begin to test every kid. They're confronted with this intensively traumatic moment where they have to stand and deliver on a test that they haven't even been instructed for. So that's kind of crazy. I think here's one more issue I sort of want to get us to think specifically about. The pandemic has created a boon for predatory capitalism in schools. We literally have an ever expanding market of companies that promise the sort of snake oil solutions, usually in the form of computer delivered reading intervention softwares. And I think this is very important in the context of what we're talking about. The Italian Marxist scholar Bifo Biardi talks specifically about the fact that we're living at a moment in which the children of the poor hear more language from machines than they do from human beings. So the idea that their linguistic ability and development is coming directly from literal machines as opposed to heard in context with other human beings, caring relationships that are formed between individuals. And this has profound implications. This, of course, has been part of the sort of universal dream of machine instruction that, you know, started all the way back in the 1960s when I.A. Richard wrote Designing for Escape. This idea that the future would be filled with a sort of ever rising, sort of ever informed global poor who have gained their information from machines. And so this is, you know, in some senses is a utopian or potentially a good idea, but I wanted you to see what it looks like on the ground. So initially, the district had approved $10 million for these digital contracts, but that has since ballooned to $28 million. And so one of the key programs that we're using, I just kind of want to highlight one of these programs, is Achieve 3000. And I've seen Achieve 3000 at work before. This is a program that the students absolutely hate. The year of the uprising at our school, they were doing it with ninth graders, and kids would literally run out of the back of the room because this is intensely boring, where students are sort of promised that they'll get an algorithm that will locate their reading level, and it'll help solve the achievement gap by getting them to work specifically on targeted reading skills. What it really is a reading test. It's yet another reading test that sits in a deep sort of environment of reading tests that include iReady, and the MCAPS assessment is just sort of persistent testing. But what I think is important, and this is sort of where I saw Abbott Elementary as being intensely prophetic, is that this company, if you dig into initially Achieve 3000 was owned by a company called Insight Partners. And if you look at Insight Partners' other holdings, they don't have any other educational tech. What they have is data analytics. So the company that is selling at a pretty high price tag, I think the subscription cost was somewhere like $200 a student, which would buy a shelf full of books. You could buy, you know, Jason Reynolds, and you could get high interest in engaging books in the hands of children for that price tag. So the question is, why do we spend the money, but also what are they really interested in? And so when you start to sort of realize why a company that has a portfolio of data and analytics software is interested in getting an algorithm in front of children, what you realize is that it's not really about reading intervention at all. It's just that forcing children to take reading intervention tests trains an algorithm. And what they can do is have children perform labor across, and they are getting paid for it, training their algorithm, which they can then use in other domains. So this is essentially free labor. And this is quite often the problem with children of the poor who go to schools that are seen as laboratories of innovation, where people are literally test running product that they're then going to launch in another market, or they're going to scale to another market. And so just this year, Achieve 3000, which, you know, one can imagine is having, due to the pandemic and everyone's sort of panic over learning loss, a tremendous year. It was sold to McGraw-Hill, and McGraw-Hill is one of the big four educational publishing companies, among them Pearson, that not only control most of the testing apparatus and curriculum in schools, but also most of the higher ed publications, et cetera, and textbooks. So, but I think the more disturbing thing, because it makes sense that the big publishing companies would want a piece of the action, at the exact same time that they were purchasing Achieve 3000, a billionaire who runs a Platinum Equity investments put a huge funding boost into McGraw-Hill, took a large ownership stake in this place. So what I'm hoping that I've been able to do is sort of draw out the way predatory capitalism actually works in real life. Because what I get to see every day is the way in which this causes children to suffer, causes children to be confronted with deficits that seem like they can't ever be overcome. And the solutions that are constantly proposed are just more surveillance, more testing. And so it actually separates them from the thing that we know actually is the escape. And it causes them to believe things about themselves that are in absolutely no way true. But the product is the continual maintenance of the system and the continual enrichment of the people who benefit from the system. Okay, so, and just here's just the final thought, because I definitely know that I went over. This is from the tremendous and amazing Caribbean post-colonial scholar, C.L.R. James. So the cruelties of property and privilege are always more ferocious than the revenges of poverty and oppression. For the one aims at perpetuating resented injustice, and the other is merely a momentary passion, soon appeased. And I can't read this without thinking about those moments after the uprising that are really going to stay with me forever, where I had to walk children past armed Humvees and troopers with M16s, children who just wanted to come to school and spent over a week literally walking a battlefield. And immediately, of course, after the uprising, we see police budgets balloon, because the cruelties of property and privilege are always more ferocious than the revenges of poverty and oppression. And now they can predict them. All right. One last thing, I think it's important to end with Baldwin here. Baldwin very famously said that if people are denied participation in the American dream by their very presence, they will wreck it. And I think I've seen this play out. I once took a field trip to the National Gallery, and at that field trip, I had a student who she loved art. She was doing summer programs in museum curation. That was her dream, was to be a museum curator. And while we were going around the National Gallery, we were being tailed the whole way by security guards and docents. So my students were in uniforms. The uniforms were in some instances not necessarily bright and shiny, and they had their eye on them. They kept telling us to get back from paintings several times. And when a crowd of students would gather around, we'd talk about a painting, they would come over and aggressively say, get away from the painting, you're standing too close. And even though we weren't standing that close at all, this happened in several of the rooms. And finally, we were in my favorite room, the room that I was most excited. I prepped them for this room. It was the El Greco paintings. And a security guard finally said one more time, step back from those paintings. And my student, who loved art, took her finger while the security guard was looking at me, put it right on the painting. And I saw her doing this because I was standing looking at the security guard, and I was looking at her. And it was the strangest thing that I've ever seen happen, because I knew exactly why it happened. And I was both horrified and in some sense proud of her. But I think that's exactly what Baldwin is saying here, and that's exactly what we see play out. All right, so again, barely scratched the surface on this, and I think I went over time, but yeah, that's it.
Wow, Dan, thank you so much. That was such a beautiful presentation on capitalism and the trauma of poverty. You have a lot of fans in the chat box. People want to know, how can they sign up and join your class? So thank you so much for shedding light on this topic. You certainly gave me, and I think all of us, a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Hey, can I just say something to him real fast? If y'all don't mind, I know this is like, I know y'all supposed to be in the presentation. I want to say, at first, when he started off with the session, the focus session goals or whatever, it didn't make sense when he talking about the machine. But then once he broke it down, it gave me a lot to think about. So I really do appreciate that.
Thank
Awesome.
you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, back to you, Zeke or Anne.
Thanks.
Thanks, Fariha, and thanks a lot, Mr. Parsons. Really appreciated the piece about shame and how that operates. I think that's spot on. And also shout out to Abbottson Elementary, really good show. And those of us who have either taught or are current teachers, there is so many little bits you pick up. So watch that show. But no, seriously, thanks a lot, Dan. Great presentation, really thoughtful, lot to chew on, and look forward to continuing that conversation around capitalism and the trauma of poverty. So with that, it is 6:24. So we are going to go into our subcommittees. Actually, no, sorry, we're not going to go into our subcommittees just yet. Before we go into our subcommittees, so coming up relatively soon in end of February, beginning of March is the 3rd annual Healing City Summit. This sort of started actually at Dan Parsons' school. So it was 3 years ago when Mayor Young signed the Healing City Act. We did it from Frederick Douglass High School. And prior to that, folks had marched over from Coppin State, which, as most folks know, is really close to Douglass. And we had a big community fair, and there were all kinds of nonprofits and barbers and beauticians and a DJ and dancing. And this was the world of pre-COVID. So it was not, we did not have to socially distance, but it was a great time. And there were, just a whole lot of folks from different worlds engaging and interacting. And prior to that, 2 days before that, we'd gone to Morgan State with about 350 young people from around the city. Some of them Dan students, some of them other students from high schools across Baltimore, and they held a summit on healing from trauma. And there were TED Talks and poetry and panels, breakout rooms. It was really great. And so we kept the tradition going. We had a second year of it. It was virtual. Ann Coy's innovation was to have these boxes that we sent to folks. For anyone that participated, you got a box and it had caramel and it had a Healing City shirt and it had like a little stress ball thing. It was great. I mean, let's be real, online conferences are generally not that much fun, but this one actually was really good. And it kept the same theme as having a youth day and then having a more community, everybody focused day. And it was actually great. And young people completely ran the youth day, from start to finish. A lot of folks from Dr. Kyla's and Joni's Heart Smiles and the Youth Healing Alliance really helped to plan it. And they have come back and are planning a second or a third, I should say, Healing City Summit coming up at the end of February, at the beginning of March. And one of the things that I was hoping for us as the Trauma Informed Care Task Force to do was to be part of that summit in kind of an interesting way. What I was thinking is that we could do 5 little video vignettes of what our various subcommittees are working on. I think most folks in the public, even though we had that press conference with the mayor, most folks don't know what it is we've been doing. And so I think this is an opportunity to share in front of what I expect to be a pretty big audience. I forget, Ann, how many, but we had a lot of people last time, and I think we'll have even more this time. But to do little 1 to 2 minute videos about the work. We've got a guy that works on my team, Nick Mackle. He is phenomenal with the camera. He is able to film folks. So one of the things I would like to ask of everybody as we go into work groups is to think about if there are either one or two people from your subcommittee who would like to help create a video about the work that you're doing. And I think the structure would be introducing yourself and kind of sharing a little bit about how you come to this work, and then sharing what your subcommittee is and what they've been working on and why you're excited for it, why that's a priority, and just to kind of give the public a bit of a flavor of what we've all been up to. And then the idea is to intersperse each of these vignettes throughout the summit. Like decolonizing goes after the start, and then the youth committee goes after the second panel, and then the policy group closes out or whatever. But the idea is just to have these things, and I think it will break up in some ways, just like sitting, watching people speak, watching panels. They'll have some music. Nick is really good at, like, I don't know, making it feel like a real video versus just like, a little cell phone video. So that is what I would put out, is in addition to spending the next 25 minutes just working on our goals, to also come back in the last 5 minutes with one or two folks nominated from each group that would like to present in front of the camera. Any questions, comments, or thoughts on that before we all disperse? Okay, hearing and seeing none. So again, what I'm asking you to do, in addition to continuing the work of the subcommittees, is to identify 1 to 2 people within your group that would like to present a 1 to 2 minute video vignette about what we all have been up to within this task force. All right, so with that, Anne, if you would do the honor.
Yeah. So just as a heads up, the decolonizing group, you are here on the main page tonight. So you will be streaming out to the world. Zeke is going to be starting with the youth focused group, and I am going to be starting with the training group. So decolonizing folks, I'll be back in case you're like, where'd she go? So I will open the rooms.
And just one more thing real quick is we will come back at 6:55 and just share who's going to do the video stuff. And
I'm going to clarify, because I got a question in the chat. You're not making the videos today. You're just identifying who might want to speak. So we'll, in the next couple of weeks, reach out and coordinate, but you're not making anything tonight. You're just identifying who might want to speak for you all in a video. Okay, rooms are open.
Do we have to do anything to get there?
No, Phil, you came in after I'd assigned. So I've assigned you now and you should be good.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I was teaching, so I had to.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're totally good, but you should be assigned to the youth now. All right, decolonizing folks, I will be back. I'm going to go talk to training.
I love being on candid camera.
Shauna.
Can't say that I do.
That was sarcasm. So I will be right back. Y'all go on and start the meeting. I'll be right back.
Alrighty, daddy.
I think
Hi,
we're,
everyone.
hey, everybody.
It's almost the entire crew, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I know one of the goals from last week was to look at to read and be able to kind of discuss and have conversation around the articles and resources that I think it was Shauna and maybe some other folks contributed to that list. So I guess I don't know. I'll say
You
for
doing a
myself.
recap?
Yeah, I was doing a recap of last week and kind of what the homework was. And then I was going to say, based off of where I am after reading the articles, particularly the one that you were like, it's kind of heavy. That's the one I was like, yeah, I need to read that one. I'm just rethinking sort of what our entire approach is.
You see why I kept saying, please, y'all, please.
Yeah.
All right, I was
I
trying.
feel you. No, 100%. And yeah, yo, I was just over here eating popcorn, like, dang, okay. But yeah, like the litmus test, the meter, the standards, all of it sort of. I need to rethink where I thought the finish line would be. And am excited about having a dialogue today that kind of orients us into being aligned with what our understanding of decolonizing is and how it would operate in this system of a task force. Yeah.
So I do want to check in with everyone around how everybody else feels if you were able to do the homework and be honest, because we can't have a conversation if we haven't started. And if that means that we use the time that we have here for folks to start, that's fine. But I do want to say, you know, when I am doing that whole like pushback thing, it's because it is really important to me that in recognizing the oxymoronic aspect of the name of this committee, how it came about and its function, I would be out of alignment with my purpose if I did not continue to say, we don't even know what we're talking about. And by we, I'm talking about the collective we, because while I might know as a co-lead is my response, and I know really, really well, as a co-lead is my responsibility before we start saying we're about to do some fancy, grandiose thing, to ensure that we're not acting in a colonial way in the way we're doing it. And that tends to be what happens, is that we like to conflate decolonizing with anti-racist something, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's not what it is. And so in an effort to be authentic, it takes a longer time, but it's the way that I have to work. And so I do want to just invite other folks to check in. I know Anne sent like 50 million, and rightfully so, she said she was going to do it, 50 million reminders. Were you able to peruse any of the resources? And if not, how much time would you like to have so that we can actually, go deep?
I am looking, I have not had time to, I just found the email. I remember seeing it and I said I was going to get back to it, but I started a new job. I just started a new gig and I have not had time to look at it.
And so one of the video, like, I don't have a problem with, I think I posted a couple YouTubes or something. We can watch that together here. Wait, can I share my screen? Yes. So we can watch it together. I don't have a problem with doing that, but what about you, Monica and David?
I haven't read all of them. I read the same article that Jasmine did, and I watched the video that that I think it's the first one that says what is decolonization. So I started with that, and then I read the article, and I would love to discuss and see, and rethink what exactly is that we want to do. I also read some of the notes from last time in our goals document, and we talked about this briefly last time, about setting a timeline that goes beyond to let's have a training or let's have one meeting, but more, long-term goals. So I would like to hear everybody's thoughts on that. Thank you.
So I did get a chance to review some of the materials as well. It's, decolonization is a term that I'm fairly comfortable with, but I never assumed that I know everything about it. So it was good to have the insight of experts, those who really dive into decolonization, to make sure I'm on track with the way that I think about it and the way that I would construct work around it, whether it's practice, policy, whatever the case may be. So that has been helpful. And I agree, Shauna, it's a longer process. You're right, because you're really undoing one culture and replacing it with another. And you're replacing it with a culture that should be representative, not just in numbers, but in approach and just acceptance, embracing of all the perspectives that we represent, not just among Black folks, but people of color, and every configuration of humanity there is. So as with many things, it can make your head just kind of go. It's really hard to wrap your head literally and figuratively around something like that. So for us as a group and how we really demonstrate decolonization, that's what I'm most interested in. So how do we find this way of bringing this very, I think, vast concept, very introspective concept into a manner that people can really digest?
Okay, thank y'all for those varying reflections in an effort to honor that we didn't all read the same thing, right? And we all had varying levels of, availability to be able to do a thing. I'm gonna, if it's okay with y'all, would y'all like to watch a video and discuss it? Or would you like to do something else? I don't have no other ideas.
Well, since we are on the main camera here, and perhaps there are people out there who are watching this right now, I think it would be helpful to watch a video together and discuss it.
Bet. All right, hold on one moment while the YouTube loads with the, the commercial. All right, 1 second. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. This is a resource that I appreciate because TED Talks, they usually be doing, a good job of, taking very complex sort of ideas and breaking it down. And so in this we'll watch this brief video, and then we'll hold space for us to talk again. Hold on 1 second. I need to make sure I optimize this for sound so that I can mute myself, because I have a 4-year-old that likes to be on candid camera. Share sound, optimize for video clip. Got it. All right, so I'm about to hit play and mute myself. Let me know, give me a thumbs up when you can hear it, okay? Because I need to be muted.
Piali, Qualitanetzik, Niatoka, Nicola Angelica Sanchez Hood, Nimaya Pipil, and Kuskatlan. I'm so happy to be with all of you here today. What a special thing to come together to learn. Thank you so much to the Nahani family for their beautiful welcome to their territories. Because I'm speaking to you about decolonization today, I couldn't begin without once again recognizing that not only are we on the territories of this beautiful family, but we're also on the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nations territory. And although that's become a really common thing to acknowledge in Canada, that you're on someone else's territory, what often goes unsaid is that those are unsurrendered and occupied territories. So some of us might be here today as guests, and some of us have found our way here in other ways, but ultimately we're on someone else's territory. And so I really invite you to think about what that means as we explore this idea of decolonization. And as a decolonial educator, I get to have a lot of really interesting conversations with people, often really difficult conversations. But to my surprise, one of the most difficult conversations I have, one of the most difficult questions that I ask is if people can name the territories and nation on whose lands their grandmothers were born. And for a lot of settler Canadians, this is a really difficult question to answer. And it's also one that brings up a lot of pain. And that's where I want to start this conversation today, is around this notion of colonization in relation to historical amnesia. Because although it's become a common theme in Canada that we talk about intergenerational trauma for Indigenous people, one thing that's not talked about is the intergenerational trauma that's also had to happen for settler people to be complicit in such a violent history. And in order for us to know where we want to go together, we need to know where we are, and for us to know that, we need to know where we've been. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the history of colonization in Canada, but I really want to emphasize this is a global phenomenon. There's not a single corner of the world that colonization hasn't been enacted upon. So whether you're a settler Canadian, whether you're a visitor, whether you're a newly landed immigrant, this applies to you. And if you want to learn more about your own particular history, just go home and Google colonization and your nation, and you'll see a long and violent history. But for today's purposes, we're just going to talk about colonization in Canada. And so one of the most common things that people are really aware of in terms of our colonial legacy in Canada is that of residential schools. However, what's often left out of that conversation is the fact that those residential schools were in effect for over 150 years, that the last residential school did not close until 1996, that the mortality rate in those residential schools was often around 50%, that the Canadian government intentionally used the subjects of those schools to test the impacts of starvation on human bodies, as well as the impacts of electric chairs. The creation of the RCMP was in fact to remove children from their homes in order to bring them to these schools, as well as to police Indigenous people to remain on the lands that were designated to them as reserve lands in their own home territories. And finally, this legacy resulted in the kidnapping of over 150,000 children. And that's just the children themselves that were removed. And that's not even talking about all of the generations that were implicated because of the horrible abuse that went on in these schools. So the other forms that colonization took in this country were that of biological warfare, intentional, systematic biological warfare. 90% of some of the First Nations in British Columbia were wiped out at a time when a vaccine for smallpox was available and well used among settler Canadians. This is, I think, one of the most powerful pictures that depicts the history of colonization in this country. Another strategy that was used to clear people from the land and force people into submission, into capitalism, into living on reserves, was the intentional extinction of keystone species like the buffalo in the prairies. But this happened in the north with sled dogs, it happened in the east coast with different fisheries. And so this strategy of extinction to force people into submission is part of our colonial history in Canada. So this means that if you're more than a first generation Canadian, this is historical bystander trauma that your parents and grandparents have lived through, and that in fact also lives in you. And I really want to dispel this myth today that decolonization is the work of Indigenous people. Whether you have ancestors that were colonizers or colonized, we are all colonized people. And so this work of decolonization is really work that we need to come together to do with one another, equally accepting our roles, our locations, our privileges, in ways in which we can start to move towards a future that looks like healing, that looks like justice, that looks like dismantling systems of oppression. So I'd be very happy if I could say that this historic colonization is where it ends, but unfortunately that's not the case. Today, colonization in Canada looks like the fact that we're here occupying someone else's territory. Well, there's never been treaties made or honored, at least on these territories. It looks like over 4,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country, a number that keeps on rising despite government promises of an inquiry or an intervention. It looks like common practices such as the apprehension of Indigenous babies when they're born by Child and Family Services if their families are deemed unfit by the state. It looks like over 200 First Nations who live without access to clean drinking water and other forms of infrastructure that almost every other Canadian feels entitled to. And finally, it looks like the ongoing poisoning and removal of Indigenous people from their traditional lands and territories for resource extraction processes like the tar sands and like one we're all probably very familiar with right here, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I've worked with a lot of settler people who really want to do something about this, but they don't know where to begin. And they feel paralyzed with guilt and shame about this truly ugly history that we've all found ourselves in. And so if I could just leave you with one message today, it would be this. This history is not your fault, but it absolutely is your responsibility. What happened, what has been done is not your fault, but where we find ourselves here together, whether we're Indigenous people, whether we're settler people, whether we're somewhere in between, this is work that we need to pick up. We need to have the courage to look at our past. We need to have the courage to look at where we are now, and we need to work together to figure out how we can collectively heal moving forward. I think it's really important to make the distinction between indigenization and decolonization. As Nigel mentioned, I had the incredible privilege of working on the Viceland documentary series Rise, and in that role I got to work with Indigenous communities in every continent of the world. And I want to give a shout out to all the Indigenous people on Earth, because the work of indigenization, the work of linguistic revitalization, the work of ceremony, the work of land-based practice, the work of land-based defense, Indigenous people are holding it down. And that is work for Indigenous people to do. That is not work for anyone else to pick up and start to appropriate and call their own. However, decolonization is work that belongs to all of us. Decolonization. We are never going to go back and erase the past. It has already been done. But what we can do is we can start to put spokes and wheels of oppression, of movements that create our social systems of inherent inequity. And to be totally honest, if you wanted to just be motivated to do this for selfish reasons, that would be good enough. We're looking at a state of global climate catastrophe. We're looking at mass migrations because people can no longer inhabit their homelands. And these are all ramifications of a colonial and capitalist worldview that eradicated a balance, a sense of reciprocity, a sense of spiritual connection to our homelands. And
so in the interest of time, I wanted to stop there because I think that she covered a pretty good amount of just some of the basic, very like building blocks of how robust it is. These discussions that we have are important, and so I'm wondering, in the 3 minutes that Anne just articulated, we have. And also we didn't do what Zeke had asked. We can talk about that. We can talk about that like in a second. Any reflection? I'm calling on you, Donna, because I know that you didn't have a chance.
Yes, my wheels are turning now. I can see it. I can see it's making sense now.
And so the complexity of this now, when I would be like, I don't know, y'all, is because the government is a colonial project, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's important for us to always hold those tensions and reflect that back to institutions that are looking for an easy checkbox way to maintain, because we ain't over here with the government saying we try to eradicate the government. No, they're like, how can we, keep what we got, but just make it a little less bad. And so I just think it's important for us to always speak the truth here.
Yeah, I'm definitely going back to look at the rest of the articles though, but that definitely got my wheels turned. Like, wow, if that, okay, all right, yeah.
And the only other thing I want to, it was a lot, and that was a little.
Yeah, yeah, that was a lot.
Jasmine, I see that you like, what if there was a look for deep thought? What you got on?
Yo, I don't know that you fully understand how necessary every piece of word was and that little mini curriculum you built for us was. But so first of all, starting with your talk and talking about sort of like social justice work and equity work and liberation, right? Like there is the idea of making someone have access to a system more equal. And then there is the work of liberating from the system, right? And understanding those as two separate things. And in that, re-examining all of the sort of goals and things that we've built within this committee. One. The other part is looking at what the full term of decolonization means within the structure of what we are given and what we are moving in. We are literally a subset of a colonialist structure that is asking us to give them a framework to not be who essentially they always will be, right? And so if that is the case, then what really is the work? What is it that we are doing? Are we decolonizing? Because if that is the case, that's not going to be a meeting. That's not going to be a, a training. That is going to be us getting down to the foundations of the system and realizing what that is. And then also on the other side of that, we still do need the equity work.
Right.
And do we need to separate those and say, well, here's a track for creating equity and, sustainability and all those things in this system. And then also you have the 50-year project of actually decolonizing from the structure of who you are.
No,
and
we hear that, Jasmine. But I was trying to bring y'all.
Yeah, you curated that because I went through in the order that you posted. I was like, all right. I saved the meaty one for
everybody
last.
is here. We need to stop talking, but
we delegate you, Jasmine, to do the video. Yes, and you, Shauna.
All right, cool. We did our homework. Hey, y'all. All right, we're going to have to stop talking.
That sounded really generative. That sounded good.
It was.
It was really good.
Right, great. All right, great. So we got 3 minutes left. I'm going to use them wisely. I do want to introduce Kim Legree. Did I pronounce your name right? Okay, so Kim.
I'm trying to unmute. Yes, it's actually Kim Legree Saleh. I need to update my my title there. But yes, please call me Kim, everyone. That's perfectly fine.
Awesome. So Kim is going to be our new liaison from the health department. The amazing William Kellebrew is going to be departing. He is in social work school and is working hard to get his degree. William has been an amazing partner in this work. We are super pumped to have Kim on board at this point as well. Want to really thank William for all the hard work that he put in. Just phenomenal. So with that, Kim, I'm gonna give you more of a chance to introduce yourself at a later date because I only got 1 minute and 45 seconds left. So let me do this. Let me just go around group by group so that Anne can write folks' names down and then we can follow up on these videos. Hoping that most groups or all groups were able to discuss who they want to present. So wanted to start with the youth group. Who do y'all got?
Lydell, you're muted. Look. There you go.
Yeah, we're gonna be working with Eddie from Mayor's Office of Children and Family Services, or Children and Family Success, and then also reaching out to the youth, the Healing Youth Alliance, to see if any of the young people in their group would like to step up. And yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good deal. We will be in touch. The policy group.
Fariha, and then either Nika or Delegate Boyce.
Outstanding. Got it. The medical group.
Unfortunately, a lot of our people were not here today. There's only a couple of us, so we feel like it's not fair to. We're gonna email everybody and come up with 2 people. So we're gonna get back to you because we just didn't have most of our people here today.
That works. No problem. Decolonizing.
Jasmine and Shauna.
Awesome. Outstanding. And what am I saying? We got medical, youth, decolonizing, policy, the training and evaluation group.
Hey family, it's Corey. We all want to go ahead and be part of it. We agreed to each take 17 seconds to go ahead and break it up. So got Tamar, Mark, of course, myself, Nana, and Kim. We all going to go ahead and break it up and say a little segment each of us.
You know what? We're gonna make that work. That sounds great. All right, fantastic. So it is 7 o'clock on the dot. Appreciate you all. Thank you for tuning in, to the folks that tuned in via YouTube. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Expect some follow-up from Ann and I. Great to see everybody.